Prince George had been prepared to hear difficult things about duty, inheritance, and the future waiting for him. But nothing prepared him for the sentence delivered across a closed table at Windsor. The trustees did not speak about money, property, or jewels. They revealed that a crown title, privately protected in Diana's legacy arrangements, had been reserved for him, and as the meaning of those words settled over the room, George simply froze. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Prince William watched his son's face change before anyone else moved. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stayed close, knowing George had entered the meeting believing they were there to discuss old family papers connected to his future duties. The trustees were responsible for deciding when certain sealed instructions could finally be disclosed. Until that moment, even William had never been shown the full wording. The lead trustee broke the silence by opening a sealed trust instrument, a formal document created to protect instructions and pass them on under fixed conditions. He read the central decision plainly. Prince George was the designated inheritor of Diana's most guarded crown title, a ceremonial legacy designation preserved for the next generation of her direct royal line. It carried no governing power, but its meaning was enormous because Diana ordered it hidden until George could understand the burden attached to it and choose for himself freely. George did not reach for the paper. His hand stayed still beside it, and after several long seconds he asked only, "Why me?" That question cut deeper than anyone expected. William knew parts of his mother's legacy had been protected, yet he had never been told that his son stood at the center of this one. He wanted to shield George from pressure, but he also knew ignoring Diana's choice would create another wound. The trustees finally explained why the title had been concealed. Diana feared that palace politics could reshape its meaning if the designation became known too early. She wanted the decision protected from pressure, argument, and ambition. Then George noticed something else. A second sealed envelope resting beside the trust instrument, marked with his grandmother's initials. Catherine saw him look toward it and immediately understood the danger. The trustees refused to open that envelope yet. Its contents did not merely explain what George would inherit. They explained why Diana had chosen his branch of the family in the first place. Before he could read it, however, he needed to understand the unresolved history behind the title and what his grandmother had been trying so fiercely to protect. The title itself was extraordinary, but the deeper shock came from the name attached to it. Diana had died years before George was born. He knew her through photographs, family memories, and the fragments William had carefully chosen to share. Now she was no longer simply a grandmother from the past. Her decision had entered his future directly, and William suddenly faced something he had always feared: his son inheriting unfinished emotional weight. William had spent years controlling how much of that history reached his eldest child. He had told Prince George about Diana's warmth, her independence, and her belief that royal duty should never erase basic humanity. Yet he had also kept the darkest parts of her story at a distance. George was already being prepared for kingship, meaning the long process of learning the responsibilities expected of a future monarch, and his father refused to make that preparation feel like punishment for wounds created before he was born. George followed him into an adjoining room after the trustees paused the meeting. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the boy finally asked whether his grandmother had expected him to become different because of the title. William hesitated. That pause said more than any prepared answer could have done. He admitted that Diana wanted future generations to carry certain values forward, but he also told his son that no inheritance should erase the person receiving it. Catherine, Princess of Wales, felt the same fear when she spoke privately with William afterward. She worried that once Diana's name and George's inheritance became known, people would begin measuring him against a woman he had never even met. The princess understood why that mattered. George was not only growing into public responsibility, he was still forming his own identity. She told William plainly that their son could not be turned into a symbol before he had the chance to become himself. William then admitted something that changed the emotional weight of the meeting. He had known his mother left protected instructions concerning future descendants, but he had never been told that George was personally named as the intended inheritor. That detail had been withheld even from him. The trustees later confirmed the reason through the written terms. The title was not automatically tied to whoever stood closest to the throne. The distinction was crucial. Diana's wording focused on bloodline, continuity, character, and a descendant capable of carrying her principles without becoming trapped inside her conflicts. George had not been selected simply because of rank. He had been selected because the conditions pointed specifically toward him. William could protect his son from uncomfortable memories only for so long, because that wording created a far more dangerous question. If George had never been the automatic choice, then something specific must have convinced Diana to guard the title so fiercely, and the answer was buried in one decision the family would later recognize as the true point of no return. Every protected royal arrangement begins somewhere, and this one did not begin with a lawyer or a ceremonial document. It began with an argument. Years earlier, during one deeply personal conversation about what Diana feared could happen to her legacy, a proposal was raised that changed everything. She realized that after her death, symbols connected to her identity might be absorbed, renamed, or controlled by people who had never understood what they meant to her. Diana had become increasingly uneasy about the way public memory could be shaped by institutions long after a person was gone. She feared that her identity might one day be reduced to possessions, headlines, or carefully approved versions of the past. So she asked a trusted legal advisor and 2 appointed custodians to help create a ceremonial legacy title, meaning an honor with symbolic meaning but no governing power, tied to her charitable values and direct family line. The turning point came during what later became known as the Kensington Palace Legacy Meeting. Diana had been told that a future royal committee might decide how certain ceremonial associations linked to her name would be used. She listened, pushed her chair back, closed the draft placed before her, and said she would not allow her identity to become something another committee could rearrange. The words were later preserved in a documented account prepared by one of the custodians. Diana did not shout after that. She became calmer, and that calm made her decision harder to challenge. She instructed the custodians to place one protected title outside automatic palace assignment and keep it sealed until a descendant could receive it, without being swallowed by the arguments surrounding her life. For her, the title was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to survive untouched. William felt the burden of that choice years later, when he was told only that his mother had left certain wishes beyond immediate family interference. He respected the restriction, but the prince privately resented being kept outside the full reasoning. He knew enough to understand that Diana had acted deliberately, yet not enough to know who she had chosen or why. The trust document carried the answer. It stated that the title would not pass simply to Diana's eldest descendant, but to the person standing at the meeting point between her bloodline and the future crown. That condition eventually pointed toward George. It also meant the inheritance had been designed around more than birth order. The secret had survived because nobody had been forced to challenge what Diana meant by those words. Now George's name had been read aloud, and William knew the next person who had to hear them was Charles. Once the king saw exactly how the condition had been written, this would stop being only a question of legacy and become a confrontation with the monarchy Diana had feared might one day control her memory. Charles did not react with outrage when the document reached him. That would have been easier. Instead, he read the same paragraph twice, placed the paper carefully on the table, and remained silent. William knew that silence. It meant his father was measuring every consequence before speaking. But this time the prince refused to let procedures swallow the emotional truth. George had been named, Diana had chosen, and William would not allow either fact to be softened. William had insisted on delivering the trustees' summary himself. He would not let aides turn something this personal into palace language before father and son had spoken face to face. The document explained that Diana's designation sat outside ordinary royal honors, meaning it was not simply another title controlled and awarded through the usual machinery of the crown. That mattered, because George was not inheriting decoration or rank. He was inheriting a protected piece of family memory. Charles finally looked up and asked the question William had expected. Did George truly understand what accepting the title might unleash once the public learned about it? The king spoke calmly, but the concern underneath was clear. William answered without hesitation. The greater question, he said, was whether the family intended to respect Diana's choice. Silence returned. Then Charles pushed the paper slowly back across the desk. William felt old anger rising, but he kept his voice controlled. George could not become another battlefield for arguments that began before he was born. The prince warned his father that any attempt to delay or reshape the inheritance would place the boy inside the same emotional conflict that had defined so much of Diana's life. Charles rejected that accusation. He said he was trying to protect his grandson from carrying a public burden too early, not rewrite the past. Yet the explanation did little to calm William. Charles then made an admission he had never given his son before. Through a restricted palace briefing years earlier, he had learned that Diana created a protected legacy arrangement, but the king insisted he had never been shown the beneficiary or the final wording. William studied him carefully. For the first time, both men understood how effectively the secret had been kept from the entire family. Then one clause changed everything. Charles read that once the chosen descendant accepted the designation, the reigning monarch, the sovereign currently occupying the throne, was required to acknowledge it publicly. He could advise, he could warn, but he could not bury it without openly defying Diana's written condition. William had defended her choice, and Charles had discovered the limit of his control. Now the decision moved beyond both men, toward the quiet trustees who had guarded the secret for years, and who alone could determine whether George had truly met every condition required to inherit it. No raised voice was needed in the trustees' chamber. The power of the moment came from how quietly the answer was delivered. Charles asked whether the designation could be delayed. The senior trustee opened the original instrument, ran a finger beneath the relevant clause, and explained that postponement was possible only if George himself requested it. The king could advise. William could object. The palace could worry, but the choice now belonged somewhere else. Charles understood immediately why the restriction mattered. The custodians had been appointed to stop Diana's wishes from being changed by ordinary palace preference. Their task was simple but powerful: confirm that her written conditions had been met and protect the title from political pressure. The original instrument, meaning the signed legal document containing those conditions, gave them authority to enforce what she had decided, rather than what the royal household might now prefer. The senior trustee then confirmed that Prince George had reached the preparation stage described in Diana's instructions. That threshold meant he was old enough to be formally told what had been reserved for him and asked whether he wished to accept it. The elderly custodian paused while holding the signed page. His voice briefly weakened as he admitted that he and the other trustees had prepared for this moment for years. He had once promised Diana that her wishes would not be diluted, and now that promise had become real. Charles leaned back when the next condition was read. The crown could not replace George with another descendant, even if the king believed someone else might carry the responsibility more easily. That limitation struck deeply. It was not simply a loss of ceremonial control. Diana had deliberately created something capable of surviving beyond palace authority, and Charles was now being forced to confront exactly how carefully she had protected it. Then the trustees delivered the biggest surprise. George could refuse everything. Diana had written an absolute right of rejection into the arrangement, meaning her chosen descendant could walk away without punishment, replacement pressure, or public blame. William immediately understood the significance. His son was not trapped by history simply because history had selected him. But freedom came with another condition. If George accepted the title, he would have to sign a private pledge, promising that Diana's legacy would be used for service rather than status. That pledge changed the inheritance completely. It was no longer simply an honor waiting to be claimed. It was a responsibility requiring a conscious choice. For the first time, George had complete control over what happened next. Everyone expected that freedom to bring relief. Instead, when William and Catherine explained that he could walk away, their son gave them a response neither parent had prepared to hear. and suddenly the family faced an entirely different kind of crisis. Everyone had spent hours debating what Diana intended, what Charles could permit, and what the trustees were required to protect. Then George did something none of them expected. He refused to decide. He closed the folder, slid it away, and asked to leave the room. For William, that simple movement was more alarming than anger would have been. His son was no longer frozen by surprise. He was beginning to understand the cost. George was granted time immediately. The trustees formally paused the process, meaning no acceptance could be recorded, and no palace statement could be issued until he chose whether to sign Diana's pledge. That mattered, because acceptance would force public acknowledgement, while refusal would leave the designation dormant. Behind closed doors, senior royal offices quietly prepared for both outcomes, but none of that planning could settle the question inside the boy himself. George returned to his private rooms and placed the briefing papers on a desk, without opening them again. Catherine, Princess of Wales, found him alone and quickly understood what frightened him. He was not afraid of the title itself. He was afraid that accepting it would make every future choice feel like a comparison with a grandmother he had never known. Catherine did not persuade him. She told her son that he owed Diana respect, not imitation, and that no institution had the right to choose his identity for him. William felt the tension deepen that evening, when George asked a question that had nothing to do with royal duty. What was she like when nobody was watching? The prince had prepared himself to discuss responsibility, inheritance, even public pressure. He had not prepared to explain Diana simply as his mother. For several seconds he said nothing, then admitted that she could be funny, restless, stubborn, deeply kind, and sometimes completely uninterested in behaving the way people expected. William then brought out a small handwritten note Diana had once sent him about courage and kindness. He did not call it evidence. He did not use it to push George toward acceptance. He simply let his son read words written by the woman behind the public legend. George read the note twice, then folded it carefully and handed it back. Something had shifted, but the decision still had not come. George finally asked William for one conversation alone. No trustees, no courtiers, no palace advice, and no discussion of what the crown might prefer. The title had begun as an inheritance problem, but now he understood that accepting it depended on knowing Diana as family rather than history, and only his father could give him that answer. There were no advisors in the room when George finally asked the question that mattered. No trustees, no prepared statements, no portraits being invoked as symbols of duty. There was only a father and his son. George looked at William and asked whether accepting Diana's title would make everyone expect him to become like her. William's answer changed the entire direction of the story. No, she would have wanted you to become yourself. William kept the folder closed between them. He wanted the conversation to remain personal before anything became official again. The title was still only a protected legacy designation, meaning a symbolic inheritance tied to Diana's wishes rather than governing power. That distinction mattered because George was not being handed authority. He was being asked whether he wanted to carry a principle. The prince told his son that Diana's greatest strength had never been perfection. It was her willingness to follow conscience, even when doing so made life harder. George listened without interrupting. William then admitted something he had not said aloud before. Part of him had wanted the entire title to disappear. He feared that Diana's memory might become another impossible standard placed on his son, another voice telling him how he was supposed to behave. The future king confessed that he had spent years trying to protect George from exactly that kind of pressure. Saying it openly changed the mood. His son no longer felt as though he was the only person afraid. George finally admitted what had frightened him most. Everyone else seemed to understand the inheritance before he did. The trustees knew the rules. William knew the history. The palace knew the consequences. He had been the last person to understand why his own name mattered. Then he said something that caught his father completely off guard. He could accept the title only if it remained a promise of service, never a reward for being born royal. George opened the folder again and read Diana's pledge slowly. This time he did not freeze. He told William that he wanted to accept, not because the title belonged to a future king, but because his grandmother had deliberately protected his right to choose. That freedom, more than the title itself, convinced him. William signed the witness line afterward, but he refused to sign as Prince of Wales. He wrote his name only as George's father. The trustees would later record in their documented account that this distinction deeply moved them, because family had finally taken priority over institution. George had made his choice in private, but Diana's conditions demanded public acknowledgement once the pledge was signed. By morning, Windsor's most guarded family decision would no longer belong only to father and son. It was about to become a national moment. By morning, the secret that had survived for years belonged to the public. The palace statement was brief, but the reaction was anything but. Diana's name and George's future suddenly appeared together across broadcasts and front pages. Yet inside Windsor, the teenager at the center of it all was not watching television. George stood beside William reading the final acknowledgement, discovering that a choice made quietly between father and son had become something millions of people believed belonged partly to them. George read the Buckingham Palace confirmation twice before setting it aside. The statement explained that his new title came from a protected legacy arrangement created under Diana's instructions and carried symbolic rather than governing authority. That distinction mattered because the designation gave him no new constitutional power, only a public duty tied to service. Charles followed with a short statement of his own, affirming that his grandson's choice honored a deeply personal family legacy, while remaining consistent with the responsibilities already waiting for him. William watched the reaction grow and felt two emotions collide. He was proud that George had chosen freely, yet every mention of Diana reopened a loss that time had never fully erased. The prince knew his mother would have understood the pressure surrounding the moment, but she would never see what her grandson had decided. George noticed the sadness in his father's voice and admitted that the attention frightened him. His name was already being compared with hers, exactly as he had feared. William refused to let that comparison define the day. He kept his son away from most commentary and reminded him that public interpretation could not rewrite the reason he had signed the pledge. George had accepted a promise of service, not a role in someone else's memory. That difference became even more important as the reaction outside the palace turned emotional. Crowds gathered at the gates of Kensington Palace, where white flowers appeared beside handwritten cards carrying both Diana's and George's names. One card was photographed again and again. "Her compassion has another keeper." The words spread across broadcasts and front pages, becoming the clearest symbol of how the public understood the inheritance. Coverage began shifting away from privilege and toward the fact that George had been free to refuse, yet chose the responsibility anyway. Catherine joined William and George as the noise continued to build, and Charles later asked that the four of them meet privately once the public statements were complete. Britain had already decided what the moment meant outside the gates. Now George, his parents, and the king had to decide what Diana's guarded title meant inside the family when the noise finally stopped. When the family gathered again, there was no sealed envelope left to open, and no hidden clause waiting to change the story. The secret was finished. George had chosen. Charles had acknowledged it. William had made peace with allowing his son to carry something Diana had protected. What remained was more difficult than any legal decision: understanding what the inheritance actually meant. And in that final private conversation, the answer became unexpectedly simple. George was never meant to replace Diana. George sat with William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Charles, without advisors surrounding them. The urgency had changed. Nobody was fighting over procedure now, because the essential decision could no longer be altered. The ceremonial designation, meaning a symbolic title with no governing authority, had been formally entered into the protected family record, with George as its accepted holder. That single entry completed the process Diana had created, and ended the trustees' long responsibility of guarding it. Charles spoke directly to his grandson before anyone else could shape the meaning of the moment. The king told George that carrying something associated with Diana did not mean choosing sides in an old family story. He did not have to inherit arguments that began before he was born. The monarch made it clear that his future would be judged by what he did with responsibility, not by whether he repeated the choices of previous generations. George listened, and for the first time the title seemed lighter. William felt that change too. He told his son that Diana's greatest legacy had never been a title, a position, or even the public image built around her. It was the belief that rank only mattered when it helped people feel seen. The prince had spent days fearing that his mother's memory would become another weight on George's shoulders. Now he understood something different. His son had chosen the responsibility freely, and that choice mattered more than the inheritance itself. The final answer came through the trustees' closing memorandum, a written summary recording why the arrangement had been created and how it had been completed. Diana had protected the designation because she wanted one part of her royal legacy to reach the future through choice rather than entitlement. George's right to refuse had always been more important than his right to inherit. George took the pen and signed the permanent acceptance register. Catherine placed a hand on his shoulder while William remained beside him. The years of secrecy ended in that simple act. George had not replaced Diana. He had carried forward the principle she protected: service chosen freely, not history forced upon another generation. And with his signature, the title finally stopped belonging to old wounds and became what she had intended all along, a promise carried into the monarchy's future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next